Hey guys, it's Monday afternoon, starting a new week. Excuse me, I'm just getting over my cold here, so it might be a little scratchy today. But I hope you had a good weekend, even though you lost an hour of sleep. And hopefully, we can catch up on this week so that we're not all half asleep in math class. Um, we are going to do our chapter wrap up today. So hopefully, you guys feel like I understand rates. I know we learned a lot about rates. We learned about distance, and time and speed. If you remember our triangle, if we have distance at the top of our triangle and speed and time here, as long as they give us the distance, we cover that up, and that tells us if they're across from each other, we do speed and time. And the distance, we know all we need to do is if it's distance and time they give us, we cover up speed, and since they're on top of each other over one another, that's division, and so we would just divide distance and time. And again, if they give us the distance and speed but not the time, we just cover up time and we divide our distance and speed because they're over one another. So hopefully that makes sense. Whatever they don't give you, you cover up. And if they're on top of each other, it's divide. If they're next to each other, it's times. And that'll help you with some story problems if we follow those rules. We talked about that. We also talked about lots of different ways to divide to find unit rates so that we can then times it by something else. If they say that there was 2 gallons of something, we could divide it to find out how much 1 gallon is. And then we can say, okay, now I can times that unit rate where it's just 1 unit by 5 to find out how much 5 gallons is. So hopefully you're remembering all those things. That's going to come up on our test. So today we're just doing our chapter wrap up, and we're kind of overviewing everything that we've learned. So first of all, our rates. We are using those in real life situation and word problems. The people who are in charge of making the national average for math and what kids need to learn say kids are having a hard time making them in real life situations. So we use word problems to try to help them so that it's a situation rather than just a math problem. So that's where you can use rates. And rates, remember we talked about at the very first, rates can just be a ratio. Remember we talked about 2 girls to 4 boys. It could also be a rate is a little bit different because it said we had 6 miles per 1 hour, and so it's comparison of 2 quantities, but the rate is 2 different units. So our boys and our girls were both people, but our rates were miles and hours, and so that's why the difference is those are not the same. So that's the difference between ratios and rates, if you remember we went over that. Coming down on our little grid here, rates can be represented as a unit rate. Remember, a unit rate is where we take it down to where there is only 1 unit in one of our sides. So if it said there is 7 gallons of water can be poured out of our faucet in 2 minutes. Well, neither of those are in 1 unit rate. So we want to say, okay, let's take it down to 1 minute. So we would divide 7 by 2, our 7 gallons by 2, and we would figure out how much can be in one of those units. I think I said 2 minutes. So that would, if we divided by 2, it would be 1 minute, which would give us the unit rate. So if we come down on this side, unit rate, which includes problem solving. What I just talked about is if we find the unit rate for something, then we can come down and find the price. And that's what we did with our grocery store ads, trying to find the best deal on avocados or oranges or whatever you chose, where we said this. Once we find a unit rate, how much for 1 unit, whether it was 1 pound or 1 avocado, then we can go ahead and say, okay, then if it's 1 avocado for 75 cents, I can find out how much 5 avocados are by timesing it by 5. And which include problems involving constant speed. And that's what I just did with our triangle. Obviously with our triangle right here, it is just an extension of what we're doing right here. So speed equals distance over time. They're asking us the speed, so I'd cover up my speed, and it says distance divided by time. And so remember, we also had a video about average speed. Average speed is the total distance traveled divided by the total time. So if it says I traveled 26 miles in 1 hour, then I would have to convert my hour, because in order to break that down, I'd have to break it down to minutes. So I would have to say, okay, there's 60 minutes in an hour, so I would take my total time or total distance travel of 26 miles, and I would divide it by 60 minutes, which would say, okay, then if I divide it by 26, then I could travel 1 mile in however many minutes. So that's finding our average speed, because we would take all of our, if they say, well, at first, if Sally was driving and she was going 70 miles an hour on the freeway, but then she had to slow down because there was traffic on the freeway, she went 70 miles per hour on the freeway, but then she had to slow down to 30 miles an hour because of traffic. And so we'll just put mph for miles per hour. But then she sped up because the traffic got a little faster, but it was only up to 45 miles per hour. So then she got to her destination a half an hour later. We would have to add up all of these times and divide them by 3, because there's 3 times, and that would give us the average speed that Sally traveled over the whole distance. So hopefully you remember that. So if we come down here to the constant speed, which is where we just do our speed equals distance divided by time, it can also be represented like in our triangle as distance equals speed times time. So if they're asking us for distance, I cover up distance because I don't have that. And since they're side by side, I would use times, and I would say my speed times my time. Then our last one is they're asking us for time, so I cover up my T for time, and it says then I need to divide because they're on top of each other. So I would divide my distance and speed. So hopefully those make sense to you. If not, please come talk to me so that you're not confused on the test. And I'm just going to go over a couple more key concepts here at the bottom of page 179. So hopefully, if you'd like to, you can follow along with me there. So our key concept we learned in this chapter is you can use a rate to compare two quantities with different units. And that was right up here. We already went over that when we were talking about rates. How we can do miles and hours to compare them, miles per hour, but we don't, ratios are actually comparing two things that could be considered the same. So a unit rate compares a quantity to 1 unit of another quantity. So we talked about how one of those is broken down into 1 unit, 26 gallons per hour. So that would be 1 hour. Then the next one is speed is a special rate that is expresses the distance per unit or time. Miles would be the distance, per hour would be the time. Distance can be found using the formula distance equals speed and time, and we already did that on our triangle here. Time can be found using the formula time equals distance divided by speed, and we already did that on our triangle. So hopefully that helps you with a couple of the basic items that we're talking about here. I'd like to go back and go over our vocab because that will be on your test. So if you guys remember our vocab, I'm going to turn back to the very first part of our chapter where it talked about our first 2 vocabulary words. If you have your book, if you could turn with me to page number 156. Actually, sorry, 159. Here's our vocabulary words, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see those. Our vocabulary words are rate, unit rate, and speed for this first part. And remember, they're in yellow here. So the meaning of rates, we already talked about. You can use a ratio to compare two quantities that have the same units. So two quantities that have the same units is one, but then a unit rate compares two different quantities and one of them is a unit. And if you remember also, sorry, that's right down here, a unit rate compares a quantity to 1 unit of a different quantity. And then also remember, our little slash here means per. And then on page 164, we'll go over to page 164, we had the term speed. And speed is a rate that compares the distance traveled to the time taken to travel that distance, which means distance would be miles, and the travel time, the time taken to travel, is per hour, let's say. So it is defined as the distance traveled per unit time. So the last vocab word, we will turn all the way over to page 175, and we did average speed here. The speed that an object is traveling over a distance may not be the same the whole time, just like we did with Sally, how she did 70 miles per hour but had to slow down, then sped up a little bit. So her average speed would be all of those added up together, and it would tell us how fast she was traveling. So if you add them all up and divide them, it will tell you her average speed. So I believe that's all our vocabulary words. And if you just want to make sure you understand the concept map here on page 179, that should give you a good overview for things we need to know for our test. And if you understand those concepts, you should be able to get most of your answers on your test. Hopefully you guys have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.